Centre for Policy Studies has, like David Davis, consistently argued for the need for a consistent and coherent growth strategy over the last few years to accompany the deficit reduction strategy. We have been having some impact, never enough, but some. Last year, for example, we published a paper by Andrew Tyree just before the Conservative Party conference, where he called for a coherent and consistent growth strategy, and that led to an immediate bringing forward of proposals from the Chancellor at Conservative Party conference. And just last week, we published a paper looking at the confusion in the public mind about our economic predicament. It's quite terrifying that 47% of the population today think that the national debt will fall by £600 billion by the end of this Parliament. The truth is exactly the reverse. The national deficit is going up by £600 billion. That is why it's so important that we have David Davis here today to talk with clarity and sense about our economic predicament and how to get out of it. But particularly I'd like to thank Michael and everyone at the ICAEW for all their great support and help. James Brereton and Sarah Buckley have been fantastic. And finally, apart from the CPS, we are an independent organisation entirely dependent on the support of our donors and associates. So please do support us by filling in the membership cards that you were handed before you go. David?
Jim, we've got a lot more people here than I expected when we booked this this meeting 3 or 4 months ago. Reminds me of when I used to be a Shadow Home Secretary. I used to go to speak in prisons, which gave me a sort of difficult opening. You know, what do I say? In a prison, in a top security prison, you don't say it's an honour to be here, do you? And talking to a bunch of thieves and murderers, you don't say it's a privilege to speak to you. You know? So I live upon a formula I'll use with you today, which is, I'm so pleased to see so many of you here. And that's, I'm afraid, the last joke of this speech. For 45 minutes, we're now going to talk about the economy, and it is not for nothing known as the dismal science. But I don't apologise for that, because it is the most serious issue facing us today. The issue that has the biggest impact on every aspect of government, whether it's foreign affairs or home affairs, and certainly the biggest impact on the welfare of ordinary British citizens, and whether they have a job, how much they're paid in that job, what taxes they have to pay as a result of that job, what public services, what health care they get, what pensions they can expect, what education their children get. All of this is determined by the health of the economy. And the health of that economy at the moment is pretty dire. We're making heavy weather of the deficit reduction programme. The government borrowed $3.4 billion more in July than in the same month last year, as you just heard. We're going to be borrowing about $600 billion if it goes to plan, by the end of the Parliament. And the growth prospects look poor. Quite simply, we are bumping along the bottom. And it doesn't really matter if, as I suspect, the numbers are actually slightly more gloomy than reality at the moment. They probably are overstating the gloom. But it doesn't matter, because frankly, minus 0.5%, 0 or plus 0.5% are all terrible. They are all disastrous for our growth strategy and for our economic strategy. Now, of course, the Chancellor can quite properly point to reasons beyond his control. The spectacular debt overhang that we got from an incompetent and incontinent Labour government. The depression of our export markets by the futile and incompetent actions of the Eurozone banks. The devastating impact on our economy of the bank failures. He is right to point those out. But an alibi is not a policy. And there is a risk that by focusing on parcelling out the blame, we accept our circumstances with too much fatalism. In economics, to understand should not be to excuse. The parlous circumstances should not be an excuse for inaction, they should be a spur to dramatic action. Now, some will say, there are some who believe that our comparative decline is inevitable. They think that the growth of the great low-cost powers, China, India, Brazil, the other emerging markets, make the West uncompetitive and make Britain in particular uncompetitive. That we face a future of low growth, poor prospects, that we can no longer compete. That this is the new normal. This is fatalistic nonsense. And of course, we have been here before, or those of us who are old enough have been here before. In the 1970s, the British establishment was convinced that the job of government was simply to manage the decline, the comparative decline of our country. To accept that the rise of the eastern tigers would eclipse us economically, and that the Soviet Union, believe it or not, would eclipse us politically. All of that was swept away by the 1979 Thatcher government, who recognised that their job was actually to solve the problems, not simply to mitigate the consequences. And indeed, it was at that time that the Centre for Policy Studies came into being, or just before then, as an intellectual part of the Thatcher armoury at the time. So I start with one simple point, that today's difficulties are large, but they're not impossible. They're not by any means insuperable. And to highlight that, I'm going to start with an example, a counter-example if you like, and that is that of Switzerland. Switzerland's economic dependence on banking was a third greater than ours. It's bang in the middle of the Eurozone, so its dependence on the Eurozone for exports is greater than ours. Yet whilst our economy struggles, Switzerland is back up and running. While our growth rate is near zero, Switzerland is 2%. Whilst our unemployment figures stand at 8%, theirs are down at 3%. Whilst we expect to run a deficit of 6% of GDP next year, they will be in surplus by about $1.5 billion. So Britain's problems cannot simply be attributed to bad banks at home and collapsing markets abroad. It's more fundamental than that, and demands more fundamental action. Indeed, if we do not take coherent and radical approach to galvanising our economy, there is a serious risk, a real risk, that we will face a decade or even decades in the doldrums. So if we fear to act because we have anxieties that the alternative policies are too risky, we should start by facing up to the real risk, that inaction could deliver decades of decline and disappointment to a whole new generation. 1 in 5 recent graduates is out of work. We have over 1 million youth unemployed. It's our moral duty to ensure we do not allow that to lead to the creation of a lost generation of young talent. And just consider what happens when governments are too risk-averse, when nations are too fatalistic about their future, and when as a result they refuse to grasp the net. In 1990, the Japanese government, faced with a banking crisis, rather like our last one, but faced with a banking crisis, sought to save face rather than solve the problem. The consequence was 2 decades of disastrously low growth. The blue line is the growth figures, the red line are the decade averages. And the pre-crisis was 3% better than the post-crisis 2 decades. That's what happens when you don't grasp the net. And bear in mind, the old Keynesians, the old Keynesian arguments, the old Keynesian school, the very things they're calling for, increased borrowing to increase domestic demand, the Japanese did that, there it is. So, increasing expenditure on infrastructure projects, I'll tell you about that later, but they did that too. Suppressing interest rates to 0, they did that too, for nearly 2 decades. They've done all of the things that we are hearing the other side argue for in spades, and it didn't work. Worse, it left them in that dreadful position, this great country with fantastic skills, left them in that dreadful position for 2 decades. Now, it's fashionable these days to talk about behavioural economics and the role of psychology and policy. Indeed, I even understand that number 10 has a unit that specialises in nudge policies. Well, what I have in mind is rather more than a nudge. The great economic transformations of history, the great recoveries, have always had a strong psychological component. They've always had a high appearance of risk, a high drama to them. Take a few examples. One of the greatest ones of the last century, when Hans Luther and Hjalmar Schacht stopped dead the hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic in the 20s. There were many important policy actions they took relating to the issue of money supply and backing of gold and so on. But the creation of the new Reichsmark was an act of high drama, designed to persuade the public and the markets that they meant action. They could have stopped inflation, technically, in the old currency, but in practice, the political theatre of having to hand in a trillion old marks to get one Reichsmark was a statement of intent by the government, and as a result, changed the mindset of the German people. More up to date, when Margaret Thatcher's government stopped the steady decline of the British economy, that decline which was thought to be inevitable at the time, we forget some of the apparently very risky things she did. The ferociously unpopular, but actually very effective 1981 budget. We had PPSs to the Chancellor resigning over that, and yet it had its impact. The liberalisation of exchange controls, which was thought at the time to be an irresponsibly dangerous leap in the dark. The reform, of course, of the labour markets by a Conservative Party who only a few years earlier were being confidently told could not deal with the unions. Indeed, I remember those days too well. Even the most confident thing about those years were the certainties of the critics who told us it was all going to fail, all going to end in tyranny. Of course, if we'd not taken those risks, we would have continued with a comfortable certainty of continuous long-term decline. Today, what is needed is a modern equivalent, a modern shock therapy for our economy, to jolt it out of the torpor that it's now in. When one of the possible futures facing us is decades in the economic doldrums, look back at Japan, then what looks risky may in fact be the least risky course. This isn't just history, by the way. There is a much more recent and rather cogent example. Look at the example of Germany in 2003, only 9 years ago. A time when they were not the confidently dominant economy they are now. That's the unemployment numbers for them against us. They were going into a quagmire. Growing unemployment, soaring national debts, struggling to compete. They were entering an economic quagmire, and Gerhard Schröder's government was in charge, a social democratic government. And yet what they did was they took firm and resolute, indeed courageous action, most notably radical labour market and welfare reforms. And the result was this. Suddenly, growth went up, and within a year or two, the increase in unemployment turned around, and now they are showing us a clean pair of heels. The results are clear. Today, Germany is the productive powerhouse of Europe. Now, people give credit to them, for that to the euro, the fact that the euro is depressed, and that they have a competitive advantage over Southern Europe. The reason they have that comparative advantage is because they took the actions they took back in 2003, 2004. A social democratic government took that action in 2003. Now, the point about these paradoxes is they exemplify the fact that there's nothing inevitable about a nation's fate in today's global economy. I was just doing a radio interview with World at One And the interviewer said, oh, but you know, isn't Germany's culture different to ours? Well, yes, it was different to ours in 2003 too. But what changed was what the government did about it. Action matters. Resolute, determined and radical action works. But what action? What is it that works? Well, first thing to understand is that we must earn our way out of this recession, not spend our way out. The recommendations of the opposition front bench simply won't do it. I doubt, frankly, that Keynesian demand management ever quite lived up to its billing, but in an open economy like ours, I frankly think it would be disastrous. It's not a good idea to borrow money from foreigners that we cannot afford to borrow, to spend it on buying goods we cannot afford to buy from those same foreigners. That simply is a formula for passing today's debts onto tomorrow's generations. Now, the Chancellor, therefore, is right when he says that the answer to too much borrowing cannot be more borrowing. So, when I talk about a growth policy, be clear, I'm not talking about an exercise in Keynesian demand management. But a policy for growth is at heart what I want to talk about for the rest of this lecture. And the reason, obviously, I laid out at the beginning, but there's also a secondary issue, and that is apart from its obvious benefits to the welfare of our nation, our country, growth is essential to the deficit reduction strategy. Now, up is bad, down is good. This is the deficit. The dotted line in the middle is the government forecast, where they think we're going, and each line up and down from that is 1% year-on-year, repeated year-on-year growth difference. So if we've got lower growth by 1%, there's a green line, and lower growth by 2% up to the line right now. The effect of 1%, even in 1 year, 1% growth reduction is enormous. Even in 1 year, you get a 9 billion all-time worsening in the deficit. 9 billion. These are based on the OBR's own numbers, but actually I think the dynamic effect is much worse than that. But that's what it says. Now, if you have continuing poor growth, you get the sort of figures you see here. And if you get the sort of result that Japan got, remember that 3% worsening in growth, you go off this scale. You can kiss goodbye any deficit reduction strategy at all. It becomes politically impossible, which is where Japan is now. So, growth is fundamental to the deficit reduction strategy, just as the deficit reduction strategy is fundamental to growth. They are inextricably linked. You cannot get them apart. Indeed, my only criticism of the deficit reduction policy is not that it's too fierce, but if anything, it's too little too late. My eminent, brilliant colleague, John Redwood, has expounded this better than I can, and in his blog in the last year or two. He's been ahead of the curve, as he always is, and I do recommend you read it. Because it suited both major political parties to exaggerate the cuts. It suits Labour because it's domestically useful to them to turn around and say, look at the terrible things this government is doing. It suits the Conservatives because it keeps our credibility with the financial markets. So we have a conspiracy of deception between the two front benches to overstate the real level of the cuts. The raw truth is we are still spending 125 billion a year more than we raise in taxes. And that's about £1 in 5 of what we spend now. And that spending amounts to almost half of GDP. You can, depends who you believe, 45, 49%, it's in that range. So those who argue for a fiscal stimulus have got a bit of a problem. They have to start by telling us why the stimulus we've got already is not making our economy grow like gangbusters. Because plainly it isn't. So the Chancellor's right to attempt to correct the fiscal imbalance. But of itself, that's not enough. Now, the idea that the private sector would simply expand to fill the space available left by the state was an attractive one, but in our over-regulated, overburdened, over-taxed economy, it was simply never going to happen fast enough. So we need to take strong action to spur that expansion of the private sector, to fill that space. That action must liberate individuals and companies from the impediments that undermine their confidence and limit their action, freedom of action. The simple truth is the state is too large, too intrusive, too complex, too powerful, and too expensive for the good that it does at the moment. Now, I'm not a believer, some in this hall are believers in minimal state. I'm not a believer in a minimal state. I'm a believer in an optimal state. That is a state that can deliver what the citizens need without crippling the ability of its economy to compete. And I believe there is an optimum somewhere in that. But we are far, far beyond that point. Switzerland's down at 30-odd%. And all the other, even social democratic countries, are heading in that direction. In this drive to liberate the wealth-creating and employment-creating energies of the nation, in this push to liberate the animal spirits that make any vigorous economy work, we should understand that incrementalism is not enough. Small measures are not enough. For our policies to work in the timetable available, they have to be simple enough to be understood by everybody, big and bold enough to seize the imagination of would-be entrepreneurs and whose energies we want to galvanise, and not just the headline-grabbing trivia of the kind that bloated the budgets of the last 15 years. So where are we going to find the paragons who are going to drive this recovery? Well, the natural instinct in our economy is for politicians to look to the big companies. They've got the biggest factories, they go on trips with the Prime Minister and sign huge contracts and fantastic headlines when they open a factory or get a new contract. But the real action is in the 4.5 million small and medium-sized companies that create the vast majority of employment in this country, as you can see. The top line is the SMEs. 2/3. In my time working for a FTSE 100 company, a little while ago now, we always increased the revenue and the profits pretty much every year, bar one. But most of the time we did that, we actually ended up employing fewer people. Why? Because we're on a continual drive for efficiency. Nothing wrong with that. It made the company more competitive, so it preserved the jobs we had. But it didn't create new jobs. The virtue of small businesses is they create jobs and wealth. They're nimble, they're innovative. The problem is they're also much more fragile than big companies. When they succeed, their growth rates are astronomical. But the very small ones can be killed off by a single employment tribunal case or a single accounting error left on by a pig-headed tax instructor. I'm sorry to say this in this building. But although these are the defendants, the Chartered Council are the defendants in these circumstances. But it's not an accident that most insolvencies are precipitated by the revenue. Jump-starting the economy will above all involve liberating that sector to do what it does best, to create jobs and wealth. And the biggest growth killer in modern economies is regulation. Much of the modern harmful regulation, most harmful regulation, cripples the labour market and it often combines with perverse rules in the welfare system to actually damage that labour market. Last week, the Institute of Directors published a survey of over 1,000 business leaders to see how this government scored in actions of effectiveness. And Vince Capel thinks we're doing great. Well, this is what the survey showed. I'll just pick out three numbers. Reducing tax complexity, the government scored minus 62%. Reducing business regulation, minus 60%. Simplifying employment law, minus 51%. And the Institute of Chartered Accountants' own report showed that less than half of businesses thought the UK was business friendly. And if you look at the middle-sized companies, that becomes just about a third. And both those numbers are worse than last year. When the German government, that 2003 graph, when the German government launched its growth strategy in 2003, the labour market was the centre of the reform programme. Special exemptions from employment law for small companies, easing of laws governing dismissals and redundancies, protection of companies from vexatious employment lawsuits were combined with a reform of the welfare system and indeed the tax system to improve incentives to work. And as you saw, it worked. And it worked in spades. Similarly in Switzerland, it's easier to hire and fire than Britain. And the welfare system encourages the work ethic in Switzerland far more than it does here. You know, and I've had, any MPs who talk to you will have had more than one constituency case where a small company has gone out of business, not even on going to employment tribunal, but on the threat of going to employment. If you've got 3 or 4 employees and you are just getting along, you're running a small nursery or childcare operation, and somebody says, I'm going to take you to employment, you give up. And so 3 or 4 people lose their jobs. I'm a believer in justice in the workplace, don't get me wrong. But we've got to decide what we prioritise. Rights for those who are lucky enough to be in jobs, or the rights of the unemployed to get a job. And that is a very serious concern, in my view, is we've got to move that balance back. Neither Switzerland or Germany are barbaric in their treatment of their workforce. They're both viewed as rather civilised, actually. And the German reforms, remember, were introduced by a social democratic government with strong trade union links. Britain must learn from these success stories. We need to transform our labour market to make it more employment friendly, and particularly for the smaller companies in that crucial employment creation band between 5 and 500 employees. And hand in hand with employment law reform must go incentive policies which give people incentive to work. Ian Duncan Smith's welfare reform is one part of what the government's doing I can compliment without reservation, because what it's doing is a big step in the right direction by ensuring that people have a real incentive to go back to work. But Ian's reforms to make people want to work must be matched by labour law reforms that mean they are able to work. No good saying you've got to go back to work if there's no job there for you. There's no reason why we cannot replicate and indeed improve on the German Agenda 2010, which freed up the labour market, cut bureaucracy for small businesses and increased incentives to work. In effect, we need a bonfire of regulations, and we need to start with employment law, and we have a ready-made template as to how to do it. After regulation, taxation, over-taxation, is the biggest enemy of growth and the biggest killer of jobs. Yet since 2010, inherited tax hikes from the Labour government and front-loaded tax increases in the deficit reduction programme have squeezed the private sector. And remember, this is the bit that we're depending on to rest of us. We've seen the continuation of a high band of income, with additional income tax, an increase in employers' national insurance contributions, a tax on jobs, a VAT hike from 17.5% to 20%, increase in stamp duty, fuel duty, air passenger duty, and others. A country cannot tax its way to prosperity. Income taxes, employment taxes, capital taxes, sales taxes are all too high and too complex. We need to cut taxes, and we need to take a knife to the Gordian knot of the British tax code. And I apologise to the Institute that does a very some business. Keynes once said that practical men are usually the slaves of some long-dead economist. The modern equivalent is that practical politicians are often the slaves of long-dead soundbites. The Chancellor at one stage became very fond of using the phrase, no unfunded tax cuts. Sounds very irresponsible. It's no doubt intended to impress the financial markets. And it is, of course, meaningless. Taxes are not like double-entry bookkeeping, but a change in one column, leading inexorably to an identical change in another. Whenever you increase a tax rate, you can be sure you will collect less tax than you expect. Why? Because people will do less of the activity you're taxing. Whether it's working, employing people, investing, saving, spending, all of it. So you get less tax. They'll also spend more time trying to avoid paying the tax, or even, in extremis, evading. So you get even less tax. And finally, the effect of high taxes is to bend the decision-making in the economy out of shape, making the whole economy work less well. So you get even less tax again. And the harm you do is much greater than you think. Not for nothing, as it's said that the power to tax is the power to destroy. The corollary is that when you lower taxes, you get more money than you expect. In the most extreme case, of course, we'll all remember the Lawson tax reforms, when he cut the top rate tax and top rate taxpayers paid more. So what should we do about it? Well, let's start with the easy part. No new taxes. And yes, Mr. Clegg, I am talking to you. You can choose. You can either punish the rich, or you can harness the rich, their resources, their talents, their energy, in the interests of all society. But they're not the same thing. Punishing the rich is politically profitable, but often economically, in fact, it is almost always economically disastrous. Now, I yield to no one, certainly not the Deputy Prime Minister, in my wish to see the least well-off in British society have the best chances, the best opportunities, and the best public services to support them. But I agree with Abraham Lincoln, who once said, you can't make the poor rich by making the rich poor. We should also cut or eliminate those taxes that deter all that we want to encourage. Income tax, which drives wealth creators away. Employers' national insurance, which prevents entrepreneurs creating new jobs. Capital gains tax, which discourages savings, which skews investment decisions, and which has scrapped the policies that impose marginal tax rates of more than 60% on the low and middle income categories of people in Britain. But these are just stepping stones. Just stepping stones. The government actually needs a coherent long-term strategy for genuinely lower, flatter taxes. There's no need to reinvent the wheel here. A few months ago, and Tim will forgive me for talking about another agency, the Taxpayers Alliance came out with a brilliant strategy on exactly this. They laid out a map, a route map, as to how to do it. A strategy which would eliminate the vast majority of the complexity of our tax and reducing or removing the chance of tax avoidance and tax evasion, the things the government worries about so much. But most critically, it will cut down on the economic distortions and handicaps to growth that those taxes, those complex and oversized marginal taxes, create. Now, that programme will take 10 years to deliver. So we should start now and get on with it. The result of the tax cut will be, and the simplification will be, to raise money in the medium term, not to lose it. Germany, one of Germany's programmes, in the middle, you can see that in a second, one of Germany's programmes actually was cutting taxes in the middle of their deficit problem. And look where they are now, much better off than we were. And what happens, of course, if you do this? What happens is your deficits go down faster because of the growth rate. And if your deficits go down faster, you can reduce taxes again. And if you reduce taxes again, your growth rate goes up and your deficit goes down faster again. So you get into a virtuous spiral, which is precisely where Germany is and precisely where Switzerland is and where Australia and a number of other countries are too. So that's where we want to be. Our energy policies have also become the enemy of competitiveness and growth. In July of this year, a government report, not another one, a government report warned that by the end of the decade, the United Kingdom green taxes will be double the European Union average and dozens of times higher than in the United States. Cost of consumers, of course, we all know, being pushed skyward by misguided energy policies, subsidising erratic or ineffective and uncompetitive renewable energy technologies. But worst of all, for British business, we still got the worst to come. In April 2013, the government will introduce a carbon price floor, a levy on every tonne of carbon emitted. Now, for Britain's energy-intensive industries, which employ about 600,000 workers and make about 50 billion a year in the economy, this will be hugely damaging. From the government's own figures, energy-intensive businesses like steel and ceramics will see electricity costs rise by 52% by 2020. 52%. Worse still, the carbon price floor will apply here, but not to our competitors in Europe and elsewhere. So, to add insult to injury, what's happening here is that we're not actually stopping carbon dioxide production, We are simply moving it elsewhere in the world with our jobs. Let's be clear about this. We're not just talking about moving that production to Mumbai or Shanghai. We're talking about moving it to Frankfurt, Rotterdam, Milan and Marseille. Global emissions won't be reduced, they'll simply be outsourced. And this is both environmental madness and economic suicide. If we believe this is a global problem, there is no policy sense whatsoever in choosing to sacrifice British jobs just so that the same pollution is emitted elsewhere in the world. If we want low carbon power, then we should accelerate the nuclear program. It is really as simple as that. But in the meantime, we should scrap these green policies, which inflate business costs today and drop the plans for those tomorrow, because both of them will destroy jobs in Britain on a very grand scale. Let me come to something which has become very topical even over this weekend. In hard times, many a government has spent money it does not have on infrastructure projects it does not need. Let's go back to my old example of Japan. Japan has spent trillions since 1990 on projects that include an art museum that's so expensive we can't afford to have paintings, an airport so empty it has to pay people to use it, a bridge to an island which is almost unpopulated and has a bridge already anyway, and a road from nowhere to nowhere, literally a road that starts and ends in a dirt track. At its peak, Japan spent more on infrastructure than it cost to build the entire Panama Canal. So, spending money on infrastructure is not the answer, because that's the outcome. After doing all of that, they still had a 3% loss in growth. It did not work. So we should be incredibly cautious about embarking on large taxpayer-funded infrastructure projects. That being said, there is a non-Keynesian market-driven argument for some infrastructure investment. Whether we like it or not, large parts of our infrastructure in Britain are either under state control, built by the state, or they're built by monopolies under state regulation, so they are effectively run by the state. During recession, the state can take advantage of the cheaper cost of capital, the cheaper cost of labour, to carry out investment that it otherwise would want to do anyway. But there are limitations on this. It is not just any old project. First, there must be short-term projects that will be achieved during the course of the recession, and hopefully that's not a very long time. Second, each project must be designed to deliver a major long-term economic boost. Third, where possible, these projects should be done at arm's length from the state, facilitated rather than executed by the government. Now, the government's flagship infrastructure scheme, High Speed 2, fails all of these tests. And so we should cancel it. Full stop. There's 30 billion in hand, 25 billion in hand. Actually, it won't be 25 billion, it'll be twice that. But 25 billion on the accounts in hand. On the railways, what should we do? Well, if we're going to spend money on railways, there's plenty of bottlenecks to iron out. There are plenty of ways to improve the operation of the current system. There are plenty of ways to make the East Coast and West Coast train lines work better. If you really want to give Britain a competitive advantage, then let's look at something which is up to date. Perhaps we should focus on modern technologies, been handicapped by the lack of a real competitive marketplace, namely the different digital infrastructure, which in Britain is presented by one monopoly, effectively, British Telecom. Let's put that right. With a tiny fraction of what we spend on HS2, we could actually become world leaders. The moment the world leader is South Korea. By 2013, it'll have 1 gigabit broadband direct to every home, 10 times the speed of the most ambitious British plans. As it stands, only 0.2% of British households have super fast broadband. You could use similar arguments for unclogging the road system. But then we should use the private sector again. Now, the government has been using out loud about this, about using private sector funding for road building. Well, they should just get on with it. Because frankly, if we need it now. So we should do it. And, well, as for airports, I'll leave that to Boris. Ask me later if you want my real view. But let's be clear. Spending money that we don't have for its own sake is a bad idea. Sometimes promoted, I have to say, by businessmen with vested interests of their own. project does not stand up on its own economic benefits, it should not happen. Also. Now, one of the continual refrains from the small and medium-sized enterprise sector is the shortage of finance to allow them to expand, or indeed even continue. Now, I have some sympathy with this complaint. Whilst it's undoubtedly true that some of the reduction in lending has been reduced demand, some of it has been down to structural weaknesses in the banking sector. There is a quandary, of course. If you increase lending to small business, then you are going to be taking risks. And we don't want our banks to take risks, because if they go down, they take the economy with them. So what's the answer? How do we lend more but not take more risks? Well, the trade answer is make better judgments. Those used to be the sort of trading decisions, trading judgments that British banking was brilliant at. And of course, they still are. The British financial sector is still brilliant at bringing the sort of huge businesses that have come to the London Stock Exchange in the last 20 years. They're brilliant at that. The financial skills of the City of London are still there, or at least they are on the big decisions. The problem is we have lost those skills for the hundreds of thousands of small decisions that actually keep our SME sector going throughout the country. The decisions taken every month by banks as to whether or not they can extend a loan to cover this working capital, that expansion, that proposal, all those have gone. Now, why? Some decades ago, those decisions were taken by the local bank managers. I coined the phrase a little while ago. I used to call them the Captain Mannering banks, dull but useful. So when a young man or woman came into one of those banks, of course the bank manager would have the figures, the plan or whatever, but he'd also have something else. And those of you in business would recognise this is actually more informative than the figures. He'd know the character of the person coming to see him. He'd know about their energy, their drive, their imagination, their thriftiness. He probably knew what they're like at school. And if it's a local business, he'll know the market. He'll probably know the customers or their competitors. Today, most of those local banks do not exist. They've been replaced by ATMs in all the medium-sized towns in the country. Now, why has that happened? It's happened because of the massive concentration and elimination of competition in banking in Britain. We could have 30 banks on our high street without bringing banks below the sort of level of scale economy. We've got effectively 4. And with that centralisation, all those bank managers, all those local judgments disappear. So what's wrong here is we haven't got enough competition in banking. Now there is an answer, but it's not more regulation. It's very simple. It's more competition, radically more competition, radically cutting the barriers to entry for small banks to bring in the supermarkets, to bring in the people like Virgin who want to come in and provide a different competitor service. Now it's radical, but it will take a long time to work. It is not a short-term solution. But there is no short-term solution. And I have to tell you, I will make a prediction today that the small business bank the government is talking about will not be as effective as we would like it to be within the next 5 years. So, these ideas are illustrative rather than prescriptive and certainly not exhaustive. I could be here for a week going through the exhaustiveness. But the simple truth is, what's fundamentally important is that we attack the problem of low growth in our economy before, once again, our nation gets used to the idea that it can just bump along the bottom comfortably. Whilst the actions necessary prove painful in the short term, the longer we wait, the harder it will get. It was the indecision of the 1970s that made the early 1980s so traumatic and so painful when we put them right. The quicker we act, the less painful it will be. Precisely because our economy is bumping on the bottom, we need to shock it into activity. The government needs to be strategically involved with reforms like excluding small businesses from large amounts of regulation, implementing mini-jobs, cutting taxes, most importantly the employment killers, like capital gains tax, national insurance, corporation tax, abandoning the carbon price pool, and radical reform of our domestic banking system. More than this, the government should lay out a long-term vision of a tax and regulatory structure which will encourage enterprise and favour employment creation in our country. It should make clear to the people of Britain that there is a competitive future for us in the global economy. I believe Britain can compete in the markets of tomorrow if the government is willing to liberate Britain's energy, enterprise, and creative genius to do so. But there is one final political consideration. Conventional wisdom has it that supply-side strategies take a couple of years to work, and the German example is tended to hold on. But what they say is, well, that means the government will do what it does, recover the economy, lose the election, give it to the incoming government to enjoy the benefits of. We've been there before, that's what they say. Indeed, the opponents of these ideas would say, look at all the countries that have tried this. I mean, Gerhard Schroeder lost the election. So isn't this political suicide? Well, let's put to one side for a second that the national interest should preempt political interest. Maybe that's just too idealistic a view of modern politics. In my view, the conventional wisdom is just plain wrong. In most of those cases, the electorate, when it got rid of a government, did so because it thought it was just cleaning up the mess that it had created, that the pain was self-induced. In Britain, it is still just apparent that these painful proposals are necessary because of the predecessor government. Just apparent. I believe the electorate would decide, as they did with Margaret Thatcher, that this government is simply administering a medicine that's made necessary by what went before. The British electorate are a lot smarter than their politicians give them credit for. We're not quite out of time. It's the 11th hour, if not yet the 59th minute. But our Chancellor is a clever and resourceful man. He should take the opportunity of the autumn statement in a few weeks' time and lay out a plan to reinvigorate Britain. A plan that offers the prospect of growth, not austerity. A plan that will put Britain and its citizens on a path to greater competitiveness, better pay, more job opportunities, lower taxes, more effective public services. All of those flow from that. 30 years ago, we demonstrated to the world that this was possible. Now other countries, Switzerland and Germany and further afield like Australia, are showing us it can still be done. It's said amongst the Westminster glitterati, one or two of them are here, that number 10 and number 11 Downing Street both retain an admiration for Tony Blair as Prime Minister. Now, it may be true, or it may be one of those urban myths that infest Westminster. I don't know. If it is true, I have one and only one quotation from him that I will commend to them at this moment in time. It is, we are at our best when we are at our boldest. If we must learn a lesson from Tony Blair, let it be that one. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you, David. Chris Shipp from ITV News. With great respect, you say the Chancellor's the right man for the job. You just spent the last 45 minutes telling us precisely the opposite. And if you do accuse the government of inaction, which I think you probably have done over the last few minutes, do you agree with one of your colleagues that the Prime Minister at the moment is acting like a mouse, not a man?
No, and I don't, one of the things I think is not very useful in politics, and that particular quote I will take as an example, is trying to personalise these things. This is about policy making. When Margaret Thatcher carried through her terrific reforms in the 80s, there were plenty of people on board who were not of the same mind as her, Jane Pryor, Carrington and so on, but they had fierce internal debates. Talk to Chris Patten about it. Fierce internal debates about what should be done, and nobody was certain when we went into it in '79 that it would all work. So there's a perfectly legitimate alternative point of view. I'll stand here and admit, I'm even a fan of Vince Cable. I'll probably get lynched by my colleagues for saying that. But it doesn't mean I agree with everything. He was on my banking commission. But nevertheless, this is a debate that has to be had. That's why we're in a democracy. We're having a debate. And in a coalition, there's all the more reason to have that debate because there are pressures the other way. And we should win.
What about the Chancellor?
I'm going to have to do what needs to be done. Yep. Oh, yeah. So that's the back of the company.
Phil Downs, Taxpayers Alliance. You spoke of your concern that BT holds a monopoly in the UK telecoms infrastructure. Yet you also support the government scheme Broadband Delivery UK run by the DCMS. Well, how would you respond to the fact that BT is very likely to win all the bids and is going to be handed an effective subsidy of around £1 billion of taxpayers' money for a scheme that's not going to solve the problem of monopoly at all?
Well, it's not going to solve the monopoly problem. It's going to just improve slightly the digital problem. I mean, I agree with the underlying question there that we need a structural change. I think one of the great things that happened in America was when they broke up the great monopolies in this same sector. I think one of the mistakes we made, for understandable reasons, during the Thatcher years, when we privatised some of these companies, we didn't actually privatise them in smaller lumps. We left them in too big a part. But now, we're talking about a 5-year time horizon here. We need to sort this out quickly. That's not going to sort out quickly. Sorry, yeah.
Thank you. Adrian, David, you've always been very gracious in your observations on David Cameron and indeed George Osborne. I just wondered if you feel, as many like myself do, that we're hampered in as much as we are in coalition with the government, with a party who have a large section who are committed to a zero growth economy. And I just wondered how we could reconcile that and what your thoughts are on that.
Before you had said they were in coalition with the government. The political dynamic, I think, is in our favour is this. We as Conservatives can't afford to have a poor economic record going into the next election. But if we can't afford it, the Liberals certainly can't afford it. What's actually in the Liberal interest is that we succeed. And I don't care if they scream and shout and say, not our idea, and have all sorts of hissy fits in the corner. Someone can get on and do what's necessary. And the position of Chancellor in British politics historically has been one where he's been very powerful. I mean, there has been one Chancellor in recent times who hasn't even got a Prime Minister into it. I'm not recommending that. But I do think that the Chancellor should use the fact that he has got preeminent power in this area to do the things that need to be done. Otherwise, we'll all be out of job in 4 years' time. Yes?
Sophie Brody, I was just wondering, what do you think of enterprise zones, A, to stimulate growth and to regenerate deprived areas?
They're palliatives, really. I mean, without the sort of deregulation that I'd like to see, they're the sort of next best thing, really. But frankly, if I had my way in terms of deregulation, you wouldn't need them, because the whole country would be an enterprise zone.
You mentioned that we are spending 125 billion more than we are producing. That happens to be the figure which the Taxpayers Allowance says being in the EU costs us. Should we remain in the EU?
Every year? Is that the estimate? Every year? 125 billion a year, that can't be right?
Yes.
I think that's an overestimate. But to answer your question, my view is this. I would like to have a new relationship with the European Union. A market-based relationship, not a politics-based relationship, put it broadly. But it's a decision at the end of the day, which in my view isn't mine. I'm a very strong, so one area where I'm very strong pro-referendum. But I actually think we've got to have this debate, we've got to have a negotiation with them, and then on the outcome of the negotiation, we've got to put that to the people. And I would be arguing to them, look, it's not to your advantage to have us too far into your political project, because we don't want to go with it. And one of these days we'll break away and carry it on the way to go. And the Eurozone's made that more true. Yeah. Well.
Hi David, Philip Northern Res Publica. Really support your point on SMEs and an SME-driven recovery. I just take the the point of SME lending. Most people on banking think that actually in order to drive money to SME businesses, we're going to need a new structure. And the trouble with just saying that I agree with more competition in banking is those banks already have a dominant position and they essentially can crowd anybody out. Would you take a radical pro-competition, which I favour, so far as breaking up the existing bank structures?
Yes.
So I think unless we break up the banks, perhaps even on a regional level, we're not going to create the institutional space for localised lending.
I thought it was a mistake of the government to sell to Santander and to the Co-op. Even though I'd rather approve of the Co-op Bank, I think it's a good bank, because I actually think we just need to have more banks on the high street. I've foreshortened what I said on banking because I'm talking too long. But one of the effects of centralising the bank decision making is all the bank decision makers now really is what's your collateral. If you're a small business, they'll look at your collateral. They don't know if your plan's going to work or not, but they do know what you're building with. So what you've got is something like 80% of SME lending is now property lending. And that as the Spaniards have demonstrated, they're bloody dangerous, actually. It doesn't do the job of meeting the working capital requirements, meeting maybe the intellectual capital requirements that small businesses need. You've got to have local banks. Now, there are other models. There's Handelsbank, which is a Swedish bank, which gives its local manager 3 million as his single loan upper limit. And that's a lot of money for a small business. We could encourage that. And we could set up tax structures to encourage that. And we haven't done that either. But basically, we should have taken the opportunity we had when we were selling off those chains of banks to actually create new, to float new businesses. We didn't do it. So maybe break up is the other way. So, right, then, end of this.
It's Graham from Sponsor Europe. I just wanted to ask a question about a specific. I spoke to a guy at Dawson International.
Sorry,
the CFO and the CEO of Dawson International. Now, they were a company that were forced into administration because of their dealings with they were trying to do a deal over their pension liabilities. Now, it was obvious to everyone in this case that the company had more members of the pension plan than they did employees paying into it, and he expressed his frustration with this. So my question is, in terms of your comments about regulation, what would you do to help out these organisations where it's obvious that they're never going to be able to pay off these pension liabilities?
Well, I mean, I don't have a ready-made solution for that, I'm afraid. I mean, we have made some pretty sizable mistakes in the past with respect to pension liability. We have allowed companies to underprovide historically, to take pension holidays. We've allowed companies to take over other companies in order to use the pension assets in a way we shouldn't have done. And I'm afraid there isn't any instantaneous solution to that. If the company goes down under those open, it goes down. It's just coming.
Rory Meakin, Taxpayers Alliance. Graciously, you mentioned our report on single income tax. If you which element of that would you say that the government should get on with first?
But in the short term, I'd be looking for the ones with the biggest economic bang for a buck. Now, if it were me, I would start to eradicate the national insurance from the bottom up. I'd start with small companies, micro companies, and then go bigger and bigger and bigger until it vanishes. Capital gains tax, both you and CPS have said it's a very distorted tax, it's too high, it's way above its optimal level, even if you define its optimal level as the level at which it raises the most money, which isn't the economic optimal level, but even if you define it as that, it's somewhere in between. They tend to be, I mean, there's an interesting sort of Davis's rule here, that the less popular the tax cut, the more likely it is to do good. Yeah? Politicians don't cut taxes where there's no popular sort of impetus behind it, but actually those are the ones you need to look at quite hard. And frankly, I mean, the government's done a bit on corporation tax. I push hard on that too. One of the reasons for that, ironically, again, the empirical evidence shows the lower corporation tax makes its way through the wages, and not just the chief executive's wages either. Go ahead.
John Wilden, Global Health Studios. Mr. Davis, I'm sure I'm not the only one coming here who might have mused on the point that if the name of the Prime Minister was now Davis and the name of the President of the United States was McCain, the Anglo-Saxon economies might have been in a very different position to the ones they are today. My point back to you about the public is this, that I think they have already made the decision that this government is not going to deliver the policies that you have simply described, and that the result may well be that Britain will lose its AAA rating with all the consequences of that. I think that this country, looking to you and senior backbenchers, some of which I know that are also in this room, to start pulling your weight in order to make this government realise the sorts of responsibilities you've so eloquently described today.
That's the point of this speech, is to help the government change its direction. Full stop. End of comment. Say no more. Right. How about the front here? So.
Robert Eagleton, what percentage of GDP should be under the state's control as opposed to present?
It's an elastic number because it depends on what your competition is doing. If you've got very, very low cost competition, it brings the ceiling down. But the states in Europe that have done best, I mean, like Switzerland, have been in the 30s, 30-something, 33, 38%. And we're spending, of course, 10% more, depending on what those numbers are. I don't think it's easy to get to that number accurately. What you have to do is a sort of competition analysis on your taxes. First, what is corporation tax? What is capital against your competition, against your international competition? And then work back from that, probably, is the simplest way. But I'd say probably somewhere in the 30s. And it also partly is down to the culture of the country. Probably we are a more socialist country than I would like us to be. So probably it's high 30s for us, low 30s for us. Something back there?
My name is David Davis. We were talking about the small businesses and the charges that they have to put up with. Doesn't maternity leave come into the offing?
Does?
Maternity leave.
Yeah, I think it does. I think one of the difficulties is people don't understand quite how different a big company is from a small company when these things are being dealt with. I was a director of Tate & Lyle. It was a huge company, had thousands and thousands of employees. We had a personnel department. We had a department that had nothing else to do but claim government grants. That's the sort of thing that happens in big companies. And you can move people around. If you've got a company that's a shop with 3 people, what do you do when somebody takes long maternity leave? So I think the micro companies, there is an argument to say if you join a company like this, you've got a different set of rights to the big companies. And I am rather soft and kindly by comparison to some in this area, but I think that at the end of the day we have to think about the rights of the guy who's standing on the street with no job as much as the person inside the door in the wall with a job. And that's it. It will probably make this the last one. Yeah.
Alex Dean, Weather Chamber. David, I agree with your prescription. What will you do if the government doesn't take your advice?
Keep on. I'm not going to have any more by-elections, that's for sure. Yes. Keep arguing. That's all you can do. In a democracy, you keep arguing. One of the things that's different, actually, about this government, because it's a coalition, is that I think it's much more reasonable for those of us who don't agree with the main government line to argue the case very publicly. Historically, it's always been, well, you know, you have your chat with the chief whip, you have your chat with the minister, and then you shut up, you know. But when Simon Hughes or Vince Cable or whoever, or Charlie Kennedy, take a public stance saying we want longer maternity leave, or we want higher taxes, or Mr. Clegg said publicly, when it's not government policy, we want to tax the rich more, then we are legitimised to make the opposite argument. And then who has the best argument wins, I hope. Yeah. Can I say thank you to everybody, thank you to the Centre for Policy Studies and to the Institute of Chartered Accountants. I think they've been very generous, the Institute, letting me come here and talk down a large part of their work, which is that of giving advice on tax. But I'm somebody who thinks that, you know, I've employed lots and lots of chartered accountants in my time, and they have pretty much universally been very strong right arm in my time in business. So then I'm doubly grateful for inviting us, and to the Centre for Policy Studies, thank you again for giving me this chance. Thank you.